Hey everybody. Hi. Of course the girls are coming up. If I could move the camera down I'd show you, but if I move it the whole thing will fall apart. It's being held up with strings right now, so I'm going to let a few more people hop on here before we get started with tonight's humor break. And I'm glad you guys have come back for some more stories. I think it's doing some good. People have said that they've enjoyed it and taken their mind off the gloom and doom of what's going on in our world and the boredom of being quarantined. So I hope it's helping a little bit. Tonight I am going to read a story that I am not doing the embarrassing. I'm not the person that gets well, I get embarrassed, but I'm not the cause of the embarrassment. And the reason is it's my dad that causes the embarrassment. And he just got home tonight from after a week of being in the hospital from having lung cancer surgery. So my mom has been staying with him at the hospital the whole time. So they both have been at the hospital since last Monday. And he got released, and they're back home tonight in their temporary home down the street. So I thought since he was home, Dad was home, I would go ahead and embarrass him tonight. And the story then that I'm going to read is called Go Tell It on the Mountain. Growing up, I was an oddity. A kid who lived within the city limits of our county seat, Hyden, population 500. Tell anyone you're from southeastern Kentucky, and visions of nearly impenetrable hills, heavy forests, and secluded communities immediately come to mind. And for the majority of people I knew during my childhood, this was a true description of their home. They lived in rugged hollows and valleys carved into the ancient Appalachian mountains that dominate the landscape of Leslie County. I, however, did not. I learned to ride my Huffy Avenger bicycle in the gridlock of traffic born from Hyden's multitude of smoothly paved city streets, including one three-way intersection with a working traffic signal that could be set to turn red, yellow, or green, although it was almost always left flashing yellow in all directions. I lived on Hickory Street, surrounded by neighbors, all with matching, small, tidy yards. The water I drank was from a city water filtration system. We had no need for such peculiarities as septic tanks or satellite television dishes. My friends who lived outside the city limits, though, had it rough. Their parents rallied political leaders in hopes of having the dirt roads leading to their homes leveled, graveled, and if a particularly good favor was owed or political scandal known, perhaps even paved. In winter, they were often stuck in their mountain home for weeks at a time due to even the smallest amount of snow. There were no plows or city services outside the limits. On the other hand, I complained when city services cleared the streets in winter, preventing me from sledding down the clean concrete of Hospital Hill. I knew Appalachia was famous for its old-fashioned, come before lunch, stay until after dinner, sing and make a lot of noise, catch the Holy Ghost type of religion. But I never experienced it. In town, you were either a Baptist or a Presbyterian. Being raised on the north side of Hyden, I was a Presbyterian. The south side were the Baptists. To get to my church, I walked 100 feet down a nice sidewalk from my house. I put in my allotted hour for praise, then raced my sister back down the street to our house where Sunday dinner would be served. Our Presbyterian services were dignified, ritual-filled, and stuffy. The singing was horrible, but the timing was exact. Anything over an hour was unacceptable and caused more than one indignant throat clearing and check of the watch by impatient parishioners. I often wondered as we were sitting down to our post-worship dinner if someone in Grassy Creek or Cutshin or other rural outposts in our county was at that very moment still in church, tossing a snake and or burning coal around the sanctuary. I'd heard about places of worship called Holiness, Pentecostal, and Church of God from friends at school and from a few cousins whose errant parents had strayed from the Presbyterian fold. However, I was kept sheltered from this strange way of churching by the mere sophistication of the city of Haydn and the elders of the Central Presbyterian Church, also known as the Frozen Chosen, due to the lack of any emotions shown during services. Knowing these forbidden churches were just a few mere miles away from me, that I could never see, and I could never see what happened during their worship, made them all the more exotic and alluring to me. By the time I graduated college, I was ready to move on from Kentucky. The mountains that had always protected and given me comfort began to grip too tightly and to block my evolving worldview. Even though there were many advantageous differences living in town, the Appalachian culture was primarily the same no matter where you lived, Hickory Street, up Rockhouse Creek, or over on Hell for certain. New ideas and liberal thinking was shunned more often than not in favor of traditional values and generation-old ways of doing things. This conservatism began to smother me as much as the very mountains themselves. I spread my wings and landed in Florida. I soon began the ritual most college students in their first career job that happens to most college students in their first career jobs, working 10 to 12 hours a day trying to impress your boss and get a promotion so that you'll no longer be at the bottom of the company totem pole. But possibly more important, I worked hard to be a success for the people in my hometown. Appalachian communities are so close and tightly woven that when one child leaves the area, everyone knows. Once gone, children of Appalachia remain very much in the fold of those left behind in their hometowns. Any achievement, big or small, by the mountain refugee is celebrated as a victory for the community. It is as if the town has sent someone out beyond the borders of its ridges and peaks to prove to the rest of the world that we can do anything they can do. The community says, we may be hillbillies, but we are just as competent as you flatlanders. Just look at what we can do. While striving for this goal of recognition, however, I was saddled with the shame of trying to distance myself from my Appalachian roots. I felt if others heard my accent or my drawl, they would automatically assume I was not intelligent. If they knew where I was from, they would only associate me with moonshiners and the movie Deliverance. Because of that, I never ate soup beans and cornbread in public, or spoke of my hometown's annual Coon on the Log contest, held every 4th of July at the Fish and Game Club. Instead, when asked, I would simply say I was from Kentucky. For residents of Florida, most of whom are not at all Southern by any means other than geography, all states south of Ohio and Pennsylvania and east of Oklahoma are considered the South and bunched indiscriminately as one, so they asked no further questions about my Kentucky heritage. My fictional sophistication made me think very highly of myself and get totally and completely above my raising. It was during this time of self-discovery that I received a phone call from my mother telling me I needed to come home to Kentucky for a family funeral. My sister's father-in-law had passed away unexpectedly. I tried to protest, saying it really wasn't a family funeral since it was just my sister's father-in-law, but in Appalachia, entire families marry each other. Her husband's family was now mine. Respect for the dead must now be shown, no matter how far away you have to travel to do it. I knew there was no arguing the point any further when my mother started using both my first and middle names. Neither time nor distance can stop a Southern boy from crumbling with fear when his mother uses his middle name in anger. Once I heard, "Keith Allen, I don't care how busy you think you are, you will book the next flight to Lexington and have your rear end at this house no later than the day after tomorrow," I knew I was headed home. Over the next day and a half, in further talks with my family members, I discovered the funeral was to be held out in the county at one of those mysterious exotic churches I'd always heard so much about but never allowed inside. Oh, sure, it was only a Methodist church, but it was still out in the county, and one could always hope for a wayward snake to slither inside or the Holy Ghost to goose a lady while she mourned. At the very least, I hoped to see at least someone anoint something with oil. The day of the funeral was unusually warm for February in southeastern Kentucky. The temperature soared into the upper 70s by mid-morning. I began to wonder if I had made a mistake bringing a heavy suit to wear instead of a lightweight one more suitable for the heat in Florida. But the heavier one was a designer brand, making it a much better choice for my grand reappearance as a hometown boy made good. I could only hope the Lower Bowens Creek Methodist Church had a central cooling system. As I came out of my childhood bedroom at my parents' home, I noticed my father ready to go. He was looking miserable, dressed in his black suit, but my mother was still in her housecoat. Conveniently, she had volunteered to babysit my sister's 3-year-old twins, so Sis would not have to deal with the rambunctiousness in a crowded church. My mother has always had a knack of slyly convincing the rest of the family, particularly my sister and me, to do her bidding without realizing we are doing it. One minute we would be playing badminton in the backyard, and the next we would be in the kitchen washing dishes from dinner while my mother was resting in a chair watching MASH, neither of us knowing exactly how we got there. The irony of insisting that I travel over 800 miles for this funeral while she stayed at home in her housecoat, though, was not lost on Mom. She busied herself with pacifiers and sippy cups to avoid any eye contact with me until my father and I headed out in his 4-wheel drive SUV for the trip to Lower Bowens Creek. By the time we finally arrived at the church in the nether regions of the county, I was both carsick and grateful we were in a 4-wheel drive. We hopped out of the car, and immediately I noticed how hot it had gotten. The sun was working overtime this midwinter's day, and the temperature had increased to over 80 degrees, hotter here than in Florida. We walked inside the small church to find it filled to near capacity, and the inside temperature even hotter than the outside. I immediately began sweating from every pore. I noticed most people there were wearing short-sleeved shirts and slacks, and even some t-shirts and jeans. I cursed my vanity that insisted I wear my designer suit, but told myself it would be worth it if only for the purpose of demonstrating my success to all who saw it. We found a seat near the front of the sanctuary and sat down. I spotted my sister sitting with her husband's family on the opposite side of the church near the front. She seemed to be frantically waving away a bug. And then I noticed a lot of people in attendance swatting away flying objects and ducking their heads to avoid being hit by incoming insects. I looked up and noticed in the very top of the church, where the two sides of the roof meet, forming the apex, was a hornet's nest. All the activity and out-of-season heat in the church must have roused them from their winter slumber. I kept a leery eye on the nest, but thought, what's the worst that could happen? We're in a church, for heaven's sake. As the service began, everyone forgot about the insects and focused on the activities up front. Everyone, I should say, except my father. As the eulogy was read by a grieving family member, an overly zealous hornet started buzzing around him, and he was acting as if it was the most dangerous thing in the world. I ignored him completely, appalled by his actions. This was my debut to the folks back home as a sophisticated modern man. We are from town. Have some manners, old man, I thought to myself. I also wondered if at that very moment Mother was having another cup of coffee and reading her Stephen King book while the twins napped. As the preacher began a solemn sermon, not the hellfire and brimstone I had hoped for in a mountain church funeral, Dad's nemesis, the hornet, began to get crazed from all the swipes he had swung at it. The hornet was mad and began to get aggressive and fight back. After a few more futile swats with his hand, Dad, sweating as if he'd been working in the fields, leaned over to me and says, "Gimme something to kill that thing with." I, of course, was horrified. "We are in a church," I whispered. "I said, gimme something to kill that thing with." "No, Dad, we are in a church. We can't kill anything in a church. If we don't kill it, it's going to sting us." Dad was now visibly shaken at the thought of being stung, sweating profusely and speaking well above a whisper. "If we do kill it, we will go to hell because we are in a church," was my final rebuttal. At this point, I noticed a couple of people disapprovingly glance over at us from the other pews. I decided it was up to me to maintain some sort of dignity and grace for our family's namesake and for my own homecoming. I was no longer a local yokel. I had moved on and up. I was a successful businessman who lived in the city and who was raised in town. I simply refused to be the local boy who was now a big city success, only to show up at the Lower Bowens Creek Methodist Church and cause a scene at a funeral. I evoke my philosophy for most things, for most all life situations. Ignore it and it'll go away. I kept thinking if I didn't respond to Dad's comments or requests for something to kill that thing with, he would let it go. I built an imaginary brick wall between us. He couldn't see me and I couldn't see him. I crossed my legs, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and began nodding at the pastor as if I had been listening to his sermon the entire time. In my peripheral vision, I saw Dad eyeing the Bible in its holder on the back of the pew in front of us. He had a hint of recognition in his face. Had he been a cartoon character, a light bulb would have illuminated above his head. As he glanced over at me, I immediately began tearing down that brick wall I had just built. I frantically shook my head no. "Surely to God you aren't thinking of," was all I had the time to whisper before Dad reached and grabbed the Bible. I watched in horror as my father, with an ever so small smile on his face, tracked the hornet with his eyes. He was a hunter stalking his prey. The pastor was just finishing up his sermon as the hornet finally lit on the window beside Dad. He then very carefully took the Bible and in slow motion, so as not to scare the bug, forcefully pressed the book flat against the window. The preacher finished his sermon with "Let us pray." In the silence between the pastor's words and the prayer, I heard the crunch of every little hornet bone being crushed by God's holy word. I could almost see the angels crying above us. If ever the Holy Ghost were going to enter a physical form, it would be now. It would enter the body of that lowly hornet and have it come back to life and sting the hell out of us both. But instead of that, God chose another form of revenge, one that really should be expected when you purposely plan and execute a murder inside the sanctuary of a church, even if it is a Methodist church. After the crunch of the cornet, we both heard a clink of glass. We looked at the window and realized that the pressure of the attack had knocked the glass loose from the window pane. All that was now holding the sheet of glass in place inside the pane was a hornet carcass and my father's Bible pressed against it. I was stunned. I said a quick, futile prayer that Dad would somehow continue his current pose and hold the glass in place for the remainder of the service, if not until everyone had vacated the church. But Dad accepted our fate, and removed his hold on the window. The glass immediately fell about 2 inches to the stone window ledge and shattered, making a loud noise people all up and down Lower Bowens Creek could hear. Certainly the 100 or so people inside the church did. I sat, still, afraid to move, afraid to blink. Dad acted as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened, and simply wiped the bug guts off the Bible and slowly returned it back to the pew in front of us. Instead of having live music or a real person sing at the funeral, the family chose to pay tribute to the deceased by playing his favorite song via a boombox placed on the podium. The pastor, trying to ignore the fact that someone had just shattered a window in his church, hit the play button, and the first strands of a guitar solo began streaming out of the speakers. At first, I thought I was mistaken, but within a couple of seconds there was no doubt about it. We were listening to Lynyrd Skynyrd's Freebird. Dad and I both stared forward toward the podium as if the Southern rock band were there in the flesh. As we watched the boombox with great interest and concern, We acted as if we had no idea why everyone in the church was staring at us. Eventually, I sneaked a glance up and over at my sister, who had turned her entire body around in her pew and was staring at us open-mouthed and was dumbfounded, with an open-mouthed, dumbfounded look on her face. I quickly averted my eyes. I told myself I could make it through this debacle. I had worked so hard at becoming suave and cityfied, but it was at this very moment that I realized it had all been a sham. I was no better than any of these people. In fact, they were much classier and more gracious than I ever could be. Here I was in a sweaty, overpriced suit with my father, the insect murderer, inside a church listening to Freebird being played from a cassette in a boombox at a funeral. I then began to feel the very first tingling of laughter building inside me. I glanced over at my father, who was looking at me with eyes that were begging to laugh. That was all it took to burst the dam. I started laughing uncontrollably, shaking all over, which in turn was all that it took my father to start in as well. We both not only laughed, but guffawed, cried, and gasped, while the crowd tried to ignore us and continue their dignified grieving. After the ceremony, we kept our heads down, made no eye contact with anyone, and headed straight for the car. We wanted to get out of Lower Bowens Creek before people could find out the names of the two uncivilized men who broke their window and acted like heathens, but my sister stepped in front of us, blocking our path. She immediately let us know that she had informed the deacon we would be sending a check to pay for the new church window, which in turn started us laughing all over again. She left us trying to control ourselves, drying our eyes, and starting our long way back to the big, sophisticated city of Haydn. And so that is tonight's story. It was called Go Tell It on the Mountain. And it's from my book, Bernadette Peters Hates Me, True Tales of a Delusional Man. And again, that was dedicated to my dad, since he's out of the hospital tonight. And I guess that will do for tonight. So if you guys have any requests or anything you want read, and it doesn't even really have to be from me. I can read something from someone else. If you have a favorite humor piece that you think everyone would like, and I don't mind sharing it. And if not, I'll just keep reading from this book. And I will see you guys tomorrow. Stay safe and happy quarantine.